There's a particular kind of pain that doesn't come from betrayal or abandonment, but from being mocked in your most honest, vulnerable moments. You weren't pretending, you weren't performing, you were praying, reaching for something higher, something deeper than the noise around you. And they laughed, they pointed, they sneered, because in your stillness they saw their own chaos. In your humility they felt their pride threatened. But what they failed to understand is this: the person who kneels in private often stands tallest in the end. What they ridiculed wasn't weakness, it was strength in a form they didn't have the courage to understand. The humiliation of the sacred. There is something deeply unsettling about the moment when a person chooses to expose their inner life to the world, only to have it met with mockery. Prayer is not a performance. It is not something done for applause or validation. It is an act of surrender, a conversation with the unseen, a discipline that demands both humility and courage. When someone chooses to pray, especially in front of others, they are offering a part of themselves that is raw and unguarded. And yet, for many, that very act becomes a target for ridicule. Why? Because in that moment, the person praying is reflecting a reality that others may have worked hard to avoid. They are making visible the hunger for meaning, the need for help, the recognition of something greater than themselves. Those who laugh at such a moment are not laughing at foolishness, they are often reacting to a mirror that reflects back everything they've tried to bury under sarcasm, distraction, or pride. Mockery, especially when aimed at something sacred, reveals more about the one mocking than the one being mocked. It is easy to scoff at what you don't understand. It is easy to point and laugh when someone chooses a path that requires quiet strength. But it's much harder to admit that the thing you're laughing at may hold the very peace you've been searching for in all the wrong places. There is a dignity in prayer that cannot be touched by cruelty, no matter how loud or public. While the world rewards display and dominance, prayer demands stillness. It is an act of restraint in a time of noise. It is a refusal to pretend that you have it all figured out. And that level of honesty, the kind that dares to kneel when others would rather stand proud, is not weakness. It's a different kind of power, one that doesn't seek to control others, but instead seeks to master the self. What the mockers fail to see is that their ridicule doesn't reach the one who truly prays with intention. Because prayer, in its most honest form, is not dependent on the reactions of others. It doesn't change based on the approval or rejection of the crowd. The one who prays is speaking to something beyond this world, something deeper, older, and more enduring than fleeting opinions. Still, we are human, and being mocked for something so personal, so meaningful, does hurt. It can feel like your soul was laughed at. It can leave a scar not because you doubt the power of what you did, but because you wonder how others could be so blind to it. Yet, even in that pain, there is refinement. There is a kind of inner fire that begins to build when your sacred moments are treated as foolish. You don't forget those moments, but over time, they become part of your strength. What begins as humiliation can be transformed into clarity. You learn that not everyone is meant to understand your journey. Not everyone has the depth to recognize what they're seeing when you kneel in prayer. Some people will mistake your spiritual discipline for weakness because they have not yet discovered what it means to truly face themselves. But here is the truth. No one who ever truly connected with the divine walked away unchanged. And no one who ever mocked the sacred walked away untouched. There is always a cost, either the pain of discipline or the ache of regret. In the end, the one who prays may be laughed at in the moment, but they often rise with a peace that outlasts the laughter. Mockery reveals more about them than you. When someone mocks you for praying, it can feel personal. It cuts deeper than a typical insult because prayer is an act rooted in honesty. It comes from a place of longing, of truth, seeking, of surrender. You weren't wearing a mask, you weren't trying to impress anyone. You were trying to speak from your soul, and for that they chose to laugh. But what we often fail to see in that moment is this: mockery is rarely about you. It's almost always a reflection of them. People mock what they don't understand, but more often they mock what challenges them. When you chose to pray in public or in private, you were demonstrating a kind of strength they weren't prepared to confront. You were showing humility. You were showing reverence. You were doing something that made them uncomfortable because it disrupted the illusion they had built around their own lives. Your prayer called attention to something they'd rather ignore, that there is more to life than the material, more than status, more than being seen. The moment you kneel, even metaphorically, is the moment they feel confronted. They may not have the words to explain why they feel uneasy, so they reach for the easiest defense: humor, sarcasm, mockery. But that doesn't mean they're strong. In fact, it often means they're avoiding something inside themselves. Your act of connection, your willingness to be vulnerable, acts like a mirror to their internal world. And mirrors don't always bring comfort. It's easier to mock than to reflect. It's easier to dismiss than to ask hard questions. If they admit that your prayer has meaning, they have to examine the emptiness in their own routines. If they acknowledge your spiritual depth, they have to confront the superficiality in their own pursuits. So they laugh, they minimize, they try to reduce your sacred moment into something they can handle, something small enough to fit inside their world. But the truth is, your prayer wasn't small, it had weight. It had intent, and the reason it triggered such a reaction is because it held power. That power wasn't loud or forceful, it was quiet, but deeply unsettling to those who have built their lives around avoiding silence. They weren't laughing at you, they were trying to laugh away their discomfort. What they never realized is that their reaction told you everything you needed to know. It revealed their fears. It revealed their spiritual immaturity. It revealed how far they were from the peace you were seeking. You don't mock what you've made peace with. You don't attack what you've integrated into your own journey. So when they laughed at your prayer, they were not showing dominance, they were exposing avoidance. Over time, you begin to see this pattern more clearly. People who are at war within themselves often project that war onto others. When you were praying, you were stepping into a space of alignment. You were trying to quiet the noise, while they were still consumed by it. That contrast was too much for them, so they turned your moment into a punchline, but it didn't change the truth. You were reaching for something eternal while they were clinging to the temporary, so let their laughter echo if it must. It will fade, because the journey you're on doesn't require their approval. It doesn't even require their understanding. What it does require is courage, and you showed it when you prayed in spite of their mockery. In the end, the one who mocks may walk away unchanged, but the one who prays walks away marked not by shame, but by strength, and that strength will carry you farther than their ridicule ever could. The power of the silent soul, there is a kind of strength that doesn't shout. It doesn't need to prove itself, and it doesn't chase attention. It remains calm when others erupt. It holds steady when chaos surrounds it. And it chooses silence not because it lacks something to say, but because it knows the weight of restraint. This is the strength of the silent soul that prays, the soul that endures mockery without retaliation. When you were mocked for praying, you didn't fight back. You didn't rise in anger or return the insult. You remained still, and in that stillness there was power. It may not have looked like it on the outside. It may have even seemed to some like you were backing down, but that couldn't be further from the truth. Choosing not to respond in kind takes far more control than reacting impulsively. It's easy to throw words when you're wounded. It's far harder to stand firm and stay rooted in your truth. In today's world, silence is often misunderstood. People mistake quietness for weakness, as if the only form of strength is loudness. But there's something deeply disciplined about a person who doesn't allow the noise around them to disturb the peace within. When you were being laughed at for praying, your decision not to respond in anger wasn't passivity. It was self-possession. It was you saying, "I know who I am, I know what I believe, and your words don't have the power to take that from me." The silent soul doesn't avoid conflict out of fear. It chooses its battles wisely. It knows that not every insult deserves a response. It understands that defending yourself against mockery sometimes only feeds the very mindset you're trying to rise above. And so it stays quiet, not because it's weak, but because it's focused. Your silence, in the face of their mockery, was an act of maturity, a signal that you're living for something higher than the approval of the crowd. There's something unshakable about a person who can be laughed at and still hold their ground. You didn't need to explain yourself. You didn't need to justify your prayer. Your actions spoke louder than their voices ever could. Because in the long run, people forget the jokes they made, but they remember the person who walked through fire and never lost their grace. Your silence was not empty. It was full of resolve, full of patience, full of purpose. You knew that responding would only lower you to a level where nothing fruitful grows. So instead, you stayed grounded. You held onto your sense of direction. You allowed your actions to speak in a language they couldn't interrupt. That's what makes a silent soul powerful. It communicates without noise. It moves without announcing. And it heals without needing recognition. Eventually, silence begins to echo. The same people who once mocked begin to feel the weight of your calm. They remember how you didn't lash out, how you didn't crumble, how you didn't run. That kind of composure isn't easily forgotten. It lingers. It challenges them in ways they can't explain, because deep down, they recognize the kind of discipline it takes to remain centered in the middle of humiliation. And that's the hidden truth. Silence, when chosen with intention, becomes a force. It doesn't rush to prove anything. It simply outlasts what is false. And when it's grounded in prayer, in depth, in unwavering self-respect, it becomes almost unshakable. The loudest voices may grab attention for a moment, but it's the quiet soul who walks away changed and who in time changes others. Spiritual depth threatens shallow people. There's an unspoken tension that arises when depth enters a space dominated by surface. When someone begins to walk a spiritual path not in pretense, but with sincerity, it exposes something uncomfortable in those who have built their identity around avoiding that depth. And often, the immediate reaction is not curiosity, but mockery. You didn't choose prayer to impress anyone. You weren't trying to be seen. You were searching, reaching for something greater, trying to make sense of your pain, your purpose, or your place in this world. That kind of honesty, that level of depth, doesn't go unnoticed. But instead of meeting it with respect, some chose to respond with ridicule. Not because your actions were foolish, but because your presence challenged the way they see themselves. People who live on the surface often find depth intimidating, not because it threatens them directly, but because it reminds them of what they've ignored. Your spiritual discipline became a quiet confrontation, a mirror they didn't ask for, reflecting back the parts of themselves they'd rather not acknowledge. So instead of turning inward, they turned on you. It's important to understand that shallow living is not always a matter of choice. Sometimes it's a defense, a shield built over years of avoiding pain, responsibility, or vulnerability. When someone suddenly chooses to pray, to reflect, to seek higher meaning, it breaks the rhythm of denial that others are dancing to. You weren't trying to interrupt their world, but your very presence disrupted it. You reminded them of the questions they've buried, the silence they've drowned out with noise. That's why people sometimes react not just with discomfort, but with mockery. Because if they acknowledge the seriousness of your journey, they would have to face their own spiritual neglect. That's a difficult confrontation not with you, but with themselves. It's easier to belittle something than to understand it. It's easier to label it as weakness, as delusion, or as unnecessary than to admit, maybe I've been avoiding something too. There's a kind of loneliness that comes with choosing a deeper path. Not because the path is wrong, but because it separates you from the noise that once felt familiar. You begin to see things differently. You speak less, but you feel more. You value moments of stillness over crowds of attention, and in that transition, those who once walked beside you may no longer recognize you. That's not your fault, it's the natural result of growth. When your inner life begins to mature, shallow minds often react not with support, but with suspicion. They may say you've changed. They may question your intentions. They may call your prayer performative, dramatic, or unnecessary. But what they don't see is the cost of that growth. They don't see the nights you wrestled with doubt, the mornings you rose with silent hope, or the times you chose patience when anger would have been easier. And that's the paradox of spiritual depth. The more rooted you become, the more others may try to shake you, not because you're unstable, but because they are. Your steadiness unsettles what is fragile in them. But you don't have to shrink yourself to make others comfortable. You weren't created to live on the surface, and the ones who mocked your prayer may never admit it, but deep down, they sensed something in you that they long for: peace, meaning, and resilience. In time, the noise fades, the voices that once laughed will quiet, and the very people who once questioned your depth may come searching for it in their own way. Until then, keep walking, keep praying, keep choosing depth over distraction, because while shallow waters are loud and restless, it's in the deep that the soul learns to breathe. Time reveals who truly kneels, and who truly falls. Mockery feels powerful in the moment. It's loud, it's public, it's often backed by laughter and the comfort of the crowd. But time is not loyal to noise. Time has its own rhythm. It observes, it waits, and it reveals. What may seem like strength in the moment can, over time, be exposed as insecurity. And what may be seen as weakness in a quiet soul can emerge as the deepest kind of strength. This is where the truth separates itself, not in the instant but in the unfolding. You may have been mocked while you prayed. You may have been seen as naive, too emotional, or even foolish for turning inward, for speaking to something greater than yourself. But time is not finished. The story does not end where the laughter begins. The journey stretches far beyond the opinions of those who only saw a fraction of who you were becoming. Prayer isn't about impressing others. It's not a performance. It's an alignment. It's a recalibration of the soul. And often, the ones who truly kneel, who surrender their ego, who admit their need for guidance, are the very ones who rise with lasting strength. At first, they may be overlooked. Quiet power is rarely recognized at the beginning, but it is always recognized in the end. The people who mocked you may have seemed confident. They may have looked untouchable, But time has a way of testing everyone. Sooner or later, life brings each of us to our knees, not by force, but by reality. No one escapes hardship, disappointment, or loss. And in those moments, the tools we've built within ourselves become either our rescue or our ruin. The soul who has learned to kneel not in defeat, but in surrender often finds wisdom that can't be taught in any other way. Meanwhile, those who mocked often find themselves in unfamiliar territory when hardship strikes. Without a sense of inner grounding, without the ability to turn to something deeper, they may feel disoriented. Because mockery never prepared them for pain, laughter never taught them how to hold grief, ridicule never strengthened their resolve, and when life no longer laughs back, they begin to feel the silence they once ignored. It's not about hoping for their downfall, it's about understanding the quiet justice of time. Those who ridiculed your connection to the sacred may one day seek it themselves, and they may remember the one they once mocked not with shame, but with realization. The one who kneeled was not weak, they were wise. The one who chose stillness over shouting had seen something they hadn't yet faced. Your journey was never about proving them wrong, it was about staying true. Time will do the rest. You don't need to defend your prayer, your silence, or your depth. What's true will echo, what's real will last, and what's shallow will fall away when the seasons change. So keep walking, keep praying, keep choosing humility, even when it's misunderstood. Because in the long story of life, it is not the loudest who lasted is the most anchored. And while others may have mocked the act of kneeling, they may one day find themselves there too, not out of imitation, but because life brought them to the same place. In that moment, your strength will no longer be silent. It will be the memory that speaks to them, the memory of someone who kneeled first, not in shame but in wisdom. And in that realization, the truth will rise quietly above all the noise that once tried to bury it.